sponsoring a winter school at Arizona State University in January 3rd through 10th. This is for graduate students, postdocs, and young faculty who are interested in the responsible innovation and social studies of emerging technologies. It is a fully paid for workshop except for travel, except for airfare. If you're interested in applying for this, I have more information. You can just come see me afterwards. Lastly, the other announcement I want to make is our speaker today will also be appearing on a future edition of the Nanovation podcast, which is put on by Professor Mike Filler. And if you don't know about the Nanovation podcast, you really should. They are excellent conversations between Mike and interesting people in the field of nanotechnology, or sometimes not even in the field of nanotechnology, and talking about a wide range of issues related to science and society. So I really encourage you to look up Nanovation on iTunes and all the various platforms. So, okay, finally, to the main event. So when I was younger, I was always told there are two things you should never discuss in public. One is politics and the other is religion. So we certainly could talk about politics if we wanted to, but instead we're going to talk about religion today. So our speaker, it's a real pleasure to have Professor Chris Toumey from the University of South Carolina. Chris did his undergraduate work at Colgate University and then a master's degree at the University of Connecticut before getting his PhD in anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. At the University of South Carolina, he has a number of different homes. He is in the Department of Anthropology. He's in the Center for Environmental Nanoscience and Risk, which is part of the School of Public Health, and also part of the South Carolina Nano Center there. I first became aware of Chris's work through his quarterly publications in Nature Nanotechnology, where he writes a quarterly commentary on nanotechnology and society. And I encourage you, if you haven't read them already, I really encourage you to take a look at them. They're short and digestible, but for the most part, I agree with almost everything you say.
Well, thank you.
So it's a real pleasure to have Chris with us today, and welcome him to Nano and Tech.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk with you. And one reason is because I believe that this particular topic is the most important work that I've done on nanotechnology, and I'll explain in a moment why, in my opinion, it is so important. But I want to begin by telling you a story, a scene from a story. Halo is a short story by the science fiction writer Charles Stross. And it describes a world late in the 21st century, say something like 75 or 80 years from now, and a world in which our material culture has been shaped according to Eric Drexler's vision of nanotechnology, his vision, which is not my vision. And if you know anything about Drexler's vision of nanotechnology, it includes this gadget that he calls a molecular assembler. And as Eric Drexler describes it, let's say you want a particular object. Maybe you want a leather belt, or maybe you want a ham sandwich, or maybe you want a baseball or something like that. And then you would have access to how many carbon atoms you need for that, and how many sulfur atoms, and how many oxygen atoms, blah, blah, blah. So you put the raw materials into this chamber, and then the universal assembler, as described by Drexler, will make something for you, make whatever you want. You just set the dial for ham sandwich or baseball or whatever. So, and in fact, actually, Drexler's universal assembler appeared frequently in science fiction when science fiction writers began to borrow from nanotechnology. Well, there's a particular scene in Halo, and it goes like this. There's a group of Muslim scholars at an Islamic seminary in Cairo, and we know that according to the Muslim halal laws, it is forbidden for a Muslim to eat bacon or ham or pork or any other meat product that comes from a pig. But this is what the scholars are debating in this particular scene. What if a molecular assembler could make an object which looks like a strip of bacon, smells like a strip of bacon, tastes like a strip of bacon, but it was never part of a living pig, would that still be forbidden by the Muslim halal laws? And by the way, I don't have a resolution to that, and neither does the short story. And I'm fond of this scene because it reminds us that nanotechnology brings us new moral, ethical, and spiritual challenges. And I'll talk about some of them. It's changing the material conditions of our lives, and it's going to evoke some questions about right and wrong. The last time I gave this talk, I had to remind the audience what nanotechnology is, and I think I don't need to do that here. But I do want to tell you that for the purpose of exploring how different religions perceive nanotechnology, I want to say that there are three technical features of nanotechnology that make it what we call in cultural anthropology a polysemic or multivalent relationship between meanings and symbols. And what that means simply is that a particular symbol means different things to different groups or different populations. And the three features are these, that we know that nanotech is not one science or technology. It's a family of sciences and technologies, and you might know it in terms of atomic physics, and somebody else might know it in terms of organic chemistry, and somebody else might know it in terms of inorganic chemistry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that nanotech to a physicist might look very different from nanotech to a chemist. And it might look very different between the organic chemist and the inorganic chemist, so that it might well be that the organic chemist or the biochemist has a lot more in common with the molecular biologist than with the inorganic chemist just down the hall. Okay. Secondly, nanotech is an emerging technology, which means there have been a couple of products, but most of the ways that it's going to change our material culture are in the future. And this means then that different people can project their own different expectations onto the future effects of nanotech. And then finally, it's not a single product or process. It's not just a better smartphone, and it's not just a better way to do polymerase chain reaction. But rather, it's what they call a generalized technology platform, like the assembly line or commercially available electricity, which is to say that it can, in the future, it's going to do many, many things. And that means, again, that different people expect nanotech to do different things. So here's the question. Why are religious reactions to nanotechnology important? George Gaskell and colleagues had a piece in Nature, I think it was, in 2005, in which it was concluded that in the United States, religious beliefs were strongly related to critical attitudes to science and technology. Dominique Brassard and her team in 2009 did a survey of approximately 900 interviewees, telephone survey, and concluded that the strength of religious beliefs is negatively related to support for funding of nanotechnology. And also at that time, Dept and his team, which includes Dominique Brassard, did an interesting study. They chose 13 nations, the US and 12 EU nations, and each of them had a position on a scale of religiosity, somebody else's prior research. They all have approximately the same levels of science and technology. You know, these are nations in Western Europe plus the US. And it was possible to survey these 13 nations according to which are more positive about nanotech and which are less so. And what Schiffler and his team found was that the more religious nations are more wary of nanotech. And look at this to see what is the most religious of the 13 nations here in this. So anyway, Schiffler writes that religiosity is the dominant predictor of moral acceptance of nanotechnology. I find that almost all discourses about nanotech, whether it's ethics, morality, or whatever, are expressed in the secular voices of philosophers and ethicists, scientists, and engineers. You can see this in the first NSF proceedings on societal and ethical implications of nanotech, and in the second proceedings, and in collections like the volume Nanoethics, and in the journal Nanoethics, and many other statements. But I want to move from general statements about religious beliefs to specific cases, because different religions have different beliefs about what is real and what is unreal, what is important and what is not, what is right and what is wrong. And unfortunately, only a modest number of religious reactions to nanotechnology have been crafted. But those that have been crafted and published are nevertheless worth examining. And we'll find out later on that there are indeed some themes in these. But before I get into the religious reactions in detail, I have to do a little digression on transhumanism. And you may or may not be familiar with this movement, but transhumanism is an ambitious vision of using powerful technologies in the near future to accelerate human evolution and to steer it in certain directions. For example, the elimination of illness and disease, that humans will live more or less indefinitely. I'm not myself buying into this, but this is one of the features of humanism. And to incorporate information technology into human anatomy and human consciousness so that we can escape the limits of our biological bodies. And so there are two principal versions of this. One is the effort to craft a more or less indefinite flesh and blood lifespan. And the principal advocate for this would be Ray Kurzweil. And then the second is what transhumanists called cyber immortality, to upload our consciousness into computers, robots, and other information systems, for which the principal advocate here would be William Bainbridge, although Kurzweil and Bainbridge would agree on quite a lot. So, for example, it happened a couple of years ago in Doonesbury that Wally has a plan for cyber immortality there. Okay. Okay, so now let's jump into some of the religious reactions. In 2006, the Journal of Lutheran Ethics published a special issue on nanotech. One article began by saying there is really no specifically Lutheran position on nanotech or nanoethics. Instead, one ought to search for common ground with other Christian groups and other non-Christian groups to find a sense of natural law. And if you're not familiar with this, natural law is an idea that circulates in some Judeo-Christian circles. And the idea is that certain lessons or values that have been handed down to us from our God are more or less obvious and universal. So, for example, we have the golden rule, that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And, quite frankly, that is a more or less universal principle. You can find that in almost every religion. But how you get from a general of natural law to somehow evaluating nanotechnology is not very clear. Another author, citing Reinhold Niebuhr, recommended that we must recognize hubris in our technologies. So, for example, in that sense, a technology which is meant to cheat death would be an example of hubris in our use of technology. Another author in this issue told us that Lutherans and others know too little about the metaphysics of atoms, molecules, and so on to pass judgment on the science of nanotech. And person's comment was, if you don't know the science, you can't do the ethics. So in effect, the Journal of Lutheran Ethics explored nanotechnology and asked some questions about whether it could be judged according to Lutheran values and beliefs. But in effect, the end result was to decline to describe a Lutheran position on nanotech. COMIS is, it's a Francophone acronym, which means the Commission of Catholic Bishops' Conferences of the European Community. And COMIS, it's a think tank in Brussels. And it explores issues from a Catholic point of view. And it's particularly interested in biomedical issues, so that in 2006, it produced a white paper on nanomedicine. And it asked some questions. Will nanomedicine modify the human body so that it is no longer natural or human? What if it diagnoses conditions, improves a medical diagnosis, but then there's no treatment, so the doctor can tell you what's wrong with you, but the doctor can't give you any help in curing what's wrong with you. Would that come from nanomedicine? Will diagnosis, say in utero diagnosis, lead to abortion? Will nanomedicine respect a sense of human dignity that does not depend on one's health condition? And reading between the lines, this is an admonition against using nanomedicine for euthanasia, in effect. And there's a question of how will information from nanomedicine be controlled and supervised. So what you have here is a document that comes out of a process which is very, very closely tied to classic, well-known Catholic thought. And that's exactly what Camus does. They want to examine a subject from a Catholic point of view. The EKD, and my German used to be better than, my German was never very good, but it used to be better than it is now. So I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly, and if your German is better than mine, that's okay. So that's the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland, the Evangelical Church in Germany. And it represents 26 million German Protestants from the Lutheran and Reformed and United traditions. And it produced a document on environmental issues in nanotechnology. What happened was that the European Union, about just before that time, had produced a document on environmental issues in nanotech. And the EK document is a reaction against that. So, for example, the EU called only a voluntary code of environmental health and safety for nanotech, and the EKD replied that a voluntary code was insufficient. The EU statement addressed only basic science, and the EKD statement said it should obviously include applied science also, because the applications of nanotech are the things that are going to change our lives. And the EKD statement said that the EU statement had no clear definition of nanotech, but that there should be such a definition. Such a definition is urgent. So the EKD statement is a pretty good critique of that EU statement. And I don't have any reason to disagree with those 3 points. But I find it peculiar that the EKD statement has no grounding in anything theological or sectarian or otherwise religious. The EKD begins by saying that they're a Christian organization, and they are, and that they want to examine a topic from a Christian perspective. That's in their first sentence. And their last paragraph replicates this. But all the information about environmental issues in nanotechnology has no religious or theological content or references or connections whatsoever. A religious organization generating a statement that has no religious content, which I find peculiar. The Taba Foundation is a think tank in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And the Taba Foundation tries to serve as kind of a middleman or interpreter between Western thought, including Western science, and Muslim thought. And in 2008, the Taba Foundation produced a white paper on nanotechnology, which included concerns about social equity and toxicity and privacy and so on. I would say it's both pretty well informed about nanotech and also very thoughtful about these issues. But most of the document is not exactly about the ethical issues in nanotechnology, but it's rather a series of challenges that ask, in asking how nanotech is going to fit into Muslim thought, it asks what would be the legal rulings, for example, on creating new forms of matter. If living cells and tissues are replicated, what is their legal status? And is it permissible to create a new living creature unprecedented in nature? And if so, who can grant that permission? And I consulted with some people who know the Muslim faith better than I do, and they tell me that this is not unusual, that there's a principle of ijtihad, which I hope I've pronounced correctly, a search for Islamic procedures for issuing legal rulings, and the related question of who has the authority to issue them. So that the Taba Foundation report on nanotechnology is not so much a series of answers or rulings, but rather an exercise in trying to get the religious authority straight, the channels of authority. In other words, ijtihad. Then we come to golems in technology. For approximately 1,800 years, there have been golem stories in Jewish folklore. And what happens is there's a pious man, usually a rabbi, makes a humanoid creature. And I don't really want to use the term human, I'll just say humanoid. And he does so by using sacred knowledge. Basically, he borrows knowledge from the Supreme Being in order to make this creature. And he does it for a righteous purpose. He doesn't do it so that the golem will be his servant or his butler or something like that. But there has to be a truly righteous purpose for making a golem. And there are many ways to tell golem stories. So one of the useful things about 1,800 years of golem stories is that there are many ways to explore certain ethical issues. What are the rights of the golem? What is the golem a human? Or can we just say humanoid, whatever that means? Under what conditions can a man make a golem? What are the responsibilities of the golem maker to the golem? Because each golem story is supposed to end with the holy man returning the golem back to clay and dust. And in effect, because golem stories are a way to explore these issues, it's kind of like a platform for exploring bioethical issues. It has been over the past 18 years or so. Well, beginning in 1966, several Jewish writers began to ask whether technologies are golems. So Gershom Scholem and Azriel Rosenfeld described computers as golems. And Scholem was asked to come to an institute in Israel that had a brand new supercomputer. And he recommended that this be called Golem Aleph, Golem number 1, and that it be treated as a golem. And he did so in a way that was kind of kind and humorous. It was not in any sense a fear of computers or a fear of any other kind of technology. Rosenfeld's commentary about technologies as golems was a little bit more alarmist. You know, this is the kind of commentary you sometimes see, you know, which says, if we build robots, does that mean that robots will eventually take over our lives and order us around? Then, in 2004, Byron Sherwin began to discuss the idea that atoms and molecules manipulated by atoms are also golems. And the thing that I find really interesting about this is that the idea of a golem and the issues that come with the stories of golems are so expansive that you can explore questions about technology this way. I would say that it's really a very, very limited number of Jewish writers who are exploring whether technologies, whether computers or robots or nanotech can be golems. I don't in any sense want to say that this is Jewish thought in general. Maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't be, but it certainly isn't. But what we have here is a case in which Jewish thinkers are asking questions about nanotechnology, and they are framing those questions in terms of golem stories. Then I was saying earlier that we have this movement called Transhumanism, and there's a small number of writers, some of them Catholic, some of them Protestant, some in the U.S. and some in the U.K. who have been writing about transhumanism because, quite frankly, they are very, very alarmed by those transhumanist beliefs that I was talking about earlier. And from this group of Christian writers comes a couple of themes. One is the Christian sense of embodiment. And what this means is that Christians should be comfortable with our imperfect bodies, that bodily death is not something to escape. So what they're doing is they're critiquing the transhumanist agenda of using nanomedicine and other technologies to extend the human lifespan into 200, 300, whatever years. And on this theme, some of these Christian writers have noticed that there's a similarity of the transhumanist agenda about our bodies which is very similar to the medieval movements that were known as Albigensianism and Catharism. And if you've never heard of these, that's okay. They're really very esoteric medieval Christian heresies. But the Albigensians of medieval times taught that our bodies were not merely imperfect, but in fact our bodies are vile and corrupt, so that our goal should be to escape from that condition. So when I was telling you earlier about cyber immortality, that we could escape the imperfections of our human flesh and blood bodies by uploading our consciousness into information systems, then to these Christian writers, that goal of transhumanism is a new form of neo-Gnosticism. It's similar to what the Albigensians and the Cathars taught at the time. Secondly, these Christian writers argue that transhumanism is a misguided manipulation of evolution. It assumes a blind faith in inevitable progress through science and technology. And this brings us to a question. If the transhumanists expect nanomedicine to deliver immortality, then can nanomedicine be disentangled from the transhumanist aspirations? And now, we're asking, in effect, can nanomedicine be evaluated on its own terms without necessarily being a transhumanist project? Now, my own feeling is certainly it can be disentangled, because I think, quite frankly, that most people working in nanomedicine or any other form of nanotechnology, I think most of them have no commitment whatsoever to the transhumanist agenda. And it may well be that you've never even heard of transhumanism before this. So I do feel that that nanomedicine can stand alone without being hijacked by the transhumanist agenda, but you won't see any of this in the writings of the transhumanists. To them, this is where we're going, and nanomedicine is one of the things that's going to get us there. The final case I wanted to give you was there were two religious focus groups on nanotech. One was done in Durham in the UK, and the other one was done at Arizona State in Tempe. The focus group in the UK were described as members of an open evangelical Anglican church. And you may know that the Anglican Church in England has two principal forms to it, what they would call high church Anglicanism, very, very similar to Catholic ritual and Catholic ceremonies and Catholic traditions. And the other they call low church, which is what today we would call Baptist or evangelicals, so on and so forth. And then the focus group in the US that was done in Arizona, it included at least one Catholic, Lutheran, Latter-day Saints, and a Buddhist, and so on. But all the members of this group were religious. It was purposely constituted that way. And they had some common themes. One was a concern that nanotech threatened our sense of human nature. And this goes directly to these religious people expressing a fear of the transhumanist agenda, using nanomedicine and other technologies to change human nature. A second theme was a concern that nanotech would be an instrument of inequality and injustice. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't, but these religious people certainly expressed that concern. And there was also an observation by the authors of both of these studies. These two were done independently, they weren't coordinated. But the authors of both of these studies noted something, that the religious groups were especially articulate in discussing ethical issues in nanotech. Their concerns were not really different from those of secular people as expressed in other focus groups. But the authors of both of these studies said that the religious people were better able to explore and express these issues because the participants, being religious, had a religious language of what is right and what is wrong and so on. So I find this to be one of the most interesting things. The authors, and I don't know if they're religious or not, but and I don't think that they're trying to advocate for one religion or another, but the conclusion that they come to is that religious people should have leadership roles in exploring and expressing ethical issues in nanotech. Not that religious people would choose different issues from secular people, but that the religious people are better at articulating those issues. So anyway, we have those 7 cases there, and we have several different issues here. Are people concerned about nanotech affecting human nature? Is nanotech an issue of how we control science and technology? Are there environmental issues in nanotech? And are there issues in medical diagnostics and therapeutics? And what you see is that, except in one case, those concerns about human nature are prominent in 6 of the 7 there. It's more acute in some of them, less acute in others, but that's a common consideration. All 7 of those express one way or another concerns about how we control science and technology. And then you'll see also that 4 of the 7 raised environmental issues regarding nanotech. And we see also that 6 of the 7 were concerned about medical diagnosis and therapeutics. So anyway, that's my review of the literature on religious reactions to nanotechnology. As I became very interested in this, and as I was inspired by my colleague Jamison Wetmore at Arizona State University, Jamie Wetmore is the person who really jump-started the research on religious reactions to nanotechnology. In some ways I'm kind of following in his footsteps. I wanted to explore that furthermore, and being a cultural anthropologist, I wanted to use some ethnographic techniques to do that. So in 2010, I got a modest grant from National Science Foundation to do this. And I also benefited from having a fellowship for a 4-week research colloquium at Union Theological Seminary in New York, which was very helpful for this. And this is what I did. In Columbia, South Carolina, I recruited 7 faith communities. 4 of them were Lutheran, and in particular, the Lutheran denomination that's known as ELCA. This is the largest of all the Lutheran denominations in this country. And I recruited 1 Baptist church and 2 Black Baptist churches. And what I did was I gave them a package of 3 readings on nanotech, a couple of readings which were an introduction to nanotech, 2nd bit on nanomedicine, and a 3rd bit on environmental issues. And then with each of the 7 congregations, we had 3 discussion sessions to evoke the participants' reactions, 1 session each on the introduction and the nanomedicine, and then finally the environmental issues. 3 of these were Sunday morning adult Sunday school sessions, and the other 4 were midweek sessions modeled on Wednesday night Bible study. So in the upper left-hand corner here, we have one of the Lutheran groups discussing nanotechnology, and then on the lower right, we have a Southern Baptist group discussing nanotech. As I entered into this research, there was something I was concerned about. I thought that there might not be any difference between Lutheran and Baptist views on that for several reasons. One is most of the Christian megachurches are non-denominational. So if someone was originally Lutheran or Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian or whatever, that matters really not at all if you and your family then join one of these Christian megachurches. Numerous Christian denominations are entering into communion with each other so that a person's original grounding may be in Lutheran theology or Baptist theology. It doesn't matter very much anymore. There's a great deal of movement of individuals between Protestant denominations and also across the Protestant-Catholic divide. And the internet and other media are, I think, displacing denomination-specific media. For example, denomination-specific prayer books and your own pastor's homilies, for example, which presumably will be denominationally based. So for these reasons, I thought, I would not have been surprised if there was no difference between how the Lutherans processed ethical issues in nanotechnology versus how the Baptists did so. But actually, what I found was a certain continuity of Lutheran thought. Lutherans describe a principle they call salvation by grace through faith, which means that anything, almost anything, including science and technology, can be a source of grace if it leads other people into the Christian faith. Because then, according to the Lutheran process, once you get into the Christian faith, once you accept the Christian faith, then you get grace. The grace of God falls upon you, and then from that you get salvation. And this also means in the Lutheran tradition, this goes right back to Martin Luther himself, is that almost any occupation, including occupations in science and technology, can be a Christian ministry. So there's a rich history of Lutheran positions and commentaries on science and technology. And what I found then was that the Lutherans in this study were very positive about nanotech with some caveats. They were concerned about injustice. They were concerned about the potential of environmental harm. But certainly they did not feel that nanotech was a challenge to their Christian beliefs. And this makes sense in terms of classic Lutheran thought. The Baptists in this study had a different stance on this. They had a very, very simple standard. How does something conform to Scripture? What does Scripture say about this? And a Baptist, there are a lot of very intelligent, articulate Baptists, but a denomination like, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, they tend not to have a rich history of denominational positions on science and technology. They really have very, very few. And what I found was that the local Baptists that I had recruited into this study hesitated to either embrace or reject nanotech. And the reason why, and this is them expressing this, is that they couldn't find guidance that could be anchored in scriptural proof texts. They could not find passages in the Bible that might tell us about atoms or molecules or proteins or viruses, the material of nanotech. And so, they didn't express hostility, they didn't embrace nanotech. In effect, what they were saying was they hesitated to pass judgment on the ethical issues in this area because they couldn't find any biblical anchor to ground any particular Baptist judgment. So anyway, I find it really, really remarkable that Lutheran and Baptist differences endure, even in a topic as esoteric as nanotechnology. I mean, to me, that's really quite remarkable that that you have Lutheran and Baptist theological differences being manifest in how they think about nanotechnology, especially in those conditions of changing religion in this country that I was mentioning earlier. So anyway, I have some conclusions. I'm not trying to privilege one denomination over another. I have zero desire to do that. And I'm certainly not trying to privilege religious thought over secular thought or vice versa. That's not what I want to do, and that's not where this is going. But we know that nanotech has a great potential to change the material conditions of our lives. That's going to happen, whether it's in nanomedicine or environmental remediation or maybe environmental harm, material science, microelectronics, a lot of other areas. And the issues of right and wrong that accompany nanotech deserve to be examined. And we see that religious reactions to nanotech are currently underdeveloped compared with secular voices. And I think it would be regrettable if religious people and religious organizations excluded themselves from the examination of nanotech's questions about what is right and what is wrong. Thank you. Yeah.
Non-centralized religions such as Protestant denominations or Islamic Papua, there's no pope, so to speak. How do you see non-centralized religion in particular going from statements by scholars to everyday worshipers?
That's a really good point. And I've written a little bit about that in the past, and I don't have an easy answer for that. But one of the reasons why I did that particular field work in Columbia, South Carolina, was to see how, I don't know, what do you want to call them, grassroots Lutherans and grassroots Baptists felt, because yes, it happens all the time that that the scholars and the teachers of a particular denomination come to one sophisticated understanding, and we never know if the laity have an uptake of what the scholars write. Sometimes yes, sometimes. Usually yes. Usually yes. Yeah. Not always, but usually yes. Yeah. So that's a very good question, and it's a question that's really hard to get out. Now, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and so I want to read the documents of these religious organizations, but I don't want to end my research with the documents, and that's why I did that research. And so, like I say, I was quite surprised to find that Lutheran values and beliefs and Baptist values and beliefs are really enduring in a way that quite surprised me. But it's really tough to get at that without doing something like, say, this kind of field work or some other kind of ethnographic work. And I wish I could give you a better answer to that, but that's my answer.
At the beginning, you kind of started off talking about the semiotics and the disharmony between the disciplines, kind of how we approach nanotechnology, how we view it, and how it's talked about. And you also talked about these new mega churches and how they're non-centralized and they're not necessarily following a specific set path
Right.
as an older Lutheran church may or
Yeah.
older Baptist church. Do you see that that is causing further breakdown in the ability for these two groups to talk to each other? So as religious movements become less centralized, less controlled by some organization,
Yeah.
more mega and multiple, do you think that semiotic disharmony is increasing the difficulty for lay people to understand?
Religious lay people. You mean,
Religious lay people to
understand
understand
now.
scientific.
Well, it depends on what the mega churches and the internet sources and so on. It depends on what they say and do about science and technology. But I think of this is for better or for worse, the democratization of our understandings of science and technology. As the hierarchies are degraded by these things, then that it might be that someone, especially in one of the very decentralized religious organizations, has much less need to rely on the hierarchical authority. Now, whether they actually then what religious attitudes the individuals develop about science and technology, I think that's really hard to predict. So, in the past, we know that the Southern Baptist Convention has spoken against evolution, for example. They have a statement on evolution and creationism from about 35 years ago. But it's really hard to know what the individuals will say and do now. Now, what you can do is you can predict that almost all the megachurches are sort of conservative Christian. And I think you can predict fairly well that they will continue to be, to some degree, hostile to evolution. They'll be hostile to embryonic stem cell research because they equate that kind of research with abortion to them. To study an embryo and then to discard the embryo after the research is done, to them that's abortion. So that to a limited extent, you can predict that conservative Christians will have certain attitudes, but it's hard to know then, how that's going to translate into attitudes about, say, nanotechnology. There are some very powerful biomedical issues coming up. Because there's some therapeutic applications coming down the road very, very soon from both synthetic biology and from gene editing by CRISPR. But it's hard to tell, until religious people and religious organizations start to react to them, it's going to be very, very difficult to predict that. And what I find then is that not so much something like nanotechnology, but rather the more powerful biomedical technologies are really, really difficult for religious organizations to navigate. And quite frankly, I found a handful of religious documents about nanotechnology, and this reflects something else, which is, any religion and any religious person can take a position on evolution and creationism. It's in the news enough that people can form their own opinions. But there are relatively few religious denominations or organizations that have the resources and the infrastructure to generate thoughtful and timely statements about nanotechnology or synthetic biology or gene editing or genetically modified organisms and so on. So, yes?
I find it really interesting how much people are looking at nanotechnology, maybe sensationalized isn't the right word, but looking very far forward
Yeah.
at things that are very far from realization.
Yeah.
Right? So what we do on this campus looks nothing like Drexler, what Drexler said it was going to look like. And maybe it will. I don't know. Well, I don't want to get into Drexler really, but I wonder how much that kind of statement of what was coming by him led to people coming to nanotechnology as opposed to other areas and saying, well, this makes me really nervous, where I think a lot of these things can be said about any new thing that emerges. And you just mentioned a few things in biosci.
Yeah.
So how much of this do you think Drexler and things that happened early on in the formation of this field of science?
Well, let me put it this way. What I've seen again and again and again is that most of the time when non-scientists become curious about nanotechnology, that their entree into nanotechnology is Drexler's 1985 book, Engines of Creation. I mean, it's enormously influential among non-scientists. And the Foresight Institute in Palo Alto was created by Drexler and others specifically to advocate Drexler's vision. And while Drexler is no longer in Palo Alto, he's in England now at Oxford, nevertheless, the Foresight Institute still is dedicated to advocating Drexler's vision. But what I found also is that Drexler has, I think, really minimal influence on the actual scientific work of nanotechnology. And I think, quite frankly, there are an awful lot of people working in nanotechnology who have never heard of Drexler and have never read his book. And, it has no influence on them because the science and the engineering is so exciting and important in and of itself that they can do cool things in nanotechnology without being handcuffed to Drexler's vision. Drexler has written four books on nanotech. And the fourth one, it was published about 2 or 3 years ago. It's called Radical Abundance. And it's interesting. There are two things he's really, really annoyed about. One is that when the U.S. Congress was considering what's S-189 in 2003, it's called the 21st Century Nanotechnology Research and Development Act. Apparently the original House draft included something that was derived from his vision. But then when the Senate passed its version and they were reconciled in committee, the part that was mirroring or echoing Drexler's vision got eliminated. And quite frankly, he's furious about this. And he describes this as a dirty war on science and so on and so forth. And the other thing about his book, this is the fourth book, is that I don't know if he ever described himself as a scientist. But he describes himself more and more as an engineer in the sense that engineers are people who really do things, whereas scientists are the people who take a good topic and basically talk it to death or something like that. I mean, his comments about the difference between engineers and scientists in this book is really something. So Drexler is, I mean, quite frankly, he's very, very angry that the scientific world, including National Science Foundation, for example, has not embraced his vision the way he might have expected at one point.
That was a very famous public debate between him and Fritz Smalley.
Yeah.
At the time, which was the science against the fantasy.
Yes. In fact, in that, this is a debate that appeared in Chemical and Engineering News in was it December of 2003? I think it was December of 2003. I think it was December of 2003. And so they're arguing about that, and essentially Richard Smalley is telling Eric Drexler that he's kind of out of contact with reality. That he's got these fantasies of nanotechnology, but, in the end, the science has to be somehow anchored in reality.
Are there other examples of other technologies where there's been a Drexler-like figure? They're pretty unique.
Oh, that's a good question. There's an historian at UC Santa Barbara, Patrick McRae, and he has a book published a couple of years ago. It's called The Visioneers. And probably nobody in this room is old enough to remember this, but there used to be an astrophysicist at Princeton named Gerard O'Neill. And O'Neill advocated the colonization of space, not just the exploration of space, but that we would build colonies. We would build small artificial planets so that we could live in space. And O'Neill was famous for this, and he was on TV and so on and so forth. And there was there was a movement that was built up around O'Neill's vision. And guess what? One of the young advocates was a graduate student at MIT, Eric Drexler. And so what Patrick O'Neill is showing in his book is that Drexler's way of advocating nanotechnology is largely modeled on that of his mentor, Gerard O'Neill, as to how Gerard O'Neill advocated the colonization of space. Are there others? I can't think of any others offhand, but there probably are others, in which on the one hand, you might have a hardworking community of scientists and engineers, but then that's accompanied by some visionaries who make it very, very exciting, but who don't necessarily speak for the scientific community. There probably are others. I can't think of others offhand.
I'm sure the conversation will continue on the Nanovation podcast over that last audience.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, if you want to hear more about science and society, come to his talk tomorrow at 11 o'clock.
In Sunday school, did people reference social media? Because I figure one thing read on social media and somebody.
Well, what happens is that that's right here.